Between the 14th and 17th centuries, there was a cultural rebirth in Europe known as the Renaissance. The art of ancient Greece and Rome was being rediscovered by a new generation of gifted artists. Some of the more notable artists of the Renaissance were Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo. During his lifetime, Michelangelo produced some of the greatest masterpieces of his or any age. These include the sculptures of David and the Pietà, the painted ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and the Last Judgment. He was as gifted a painter as he was a sculptor and was also a talented architect and poet. His wonderful creations led many of his admirers to call him divine, as if God himself was guiding his hand. His patrons were some of the most important and influential people of the day. Some guided his creativity to new and exciting heights, while others forever tormented him to work faster. Michelangelo, however, would give them nothing less than perfection. Michelangelo Buonarroti was born on March 6, 1475 at Caprese in the Tuscany region near Florence. He was the second son born to Lodovico and Francesca Buonarroti. Francesca could not nurse Michelangelo, so he was sent off to live with the family of a stonecutter. The stonecutter's wife became Michelangelo's wet nurse. Later in life, he would joke that this was where his love of sculpting in stone came from. Francesca Buonarroti gave birth to 3 more sons, but the strain of childbirth was too much for her. She died in 1481 when Michelangelo was only 6 years old. He returned to live with his father and brothers in Florence at the age of 10. Even at this early age, Michelangelo had already learned to use the tools of a stonecutter. At the age of 13, Michelangelo left his family to become an apprentice to the famed Florentine painter Domenico Ghirlandaio. It was in his workshop that the young Michelangelo learned the art of fresco painting. Fresco is painting on wet plaster. When the plaster dries, the painting is bonded to the wall. Michelangelo would find this technique essential when painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the years to come. The Medici family had ruled Florence for many years and was now under the leadership of Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo the Magnificent, as he was called, was a great patron of the arts and a collector of classical statues. These statues were kept in the gardens of San Marco near the Medici Palace. In 1489, the sculptor Bertoldo di Giovanni was appointed by Lorenzo to look after the collection of statues and to train new pupils in the art of sculpting. That same year, Michelangelo left the workshop of Ghirlandaio to study the art of sculpting as a pupil to Bertoldo di Giovanni. Michelangelo lived in the Medici Palace and was treated like family. He was surrounded by the greatest poets, philosophers, and artists of the day. In 1491, Michelangelo carved a marble plaque entitled Madonna of the Stairs. It's hard to imagine that a sculpture as serene and delicate could come from the hands of a boy still in his teens. The following year, he sculpted the Battle of the Centaurs. His representation of the mythological creatures is unique in its expression of the movement and power of its subject. On April 8, 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici died at the age of 43. The man who had been so generous and influential to Michelangelo was gone. When Lorenzo's son Piero became head of the Medici family, he discontinued young Michelangelo's service to the family, and he was forced once again to live with his father's family. Always eager to examine the human form for his creations, Michelangelo was invited by the monastery of Santo Spirito to study the anatomy of the corpses in the morgue of the monastery's hospital. To repay the monastery for their generosity, Michelangelo presented the parish priest with a wooden crucifix of his own design as reproduced here. Under the leadership of Piero de' Medici, Florence was in disarray. In 1494, the armies of King Charles VIII of France entered the Italian peninsula and forced Piero and the Medici family to flee the city of Florence. Fearing for his life, Michelangelo left the city as well and eventually settled in Bologna. It was here, under the patronage of an aristocrat named Gianfrancesco Aldevarande, that Michelangelo was commissioned to create 3 small sculptures for the tomb of St. Dominic. These were the statues of St. Petronius, who was the patron saint of Bologna, St. Proculus, and a kneeling angel holding a candelabra. They represent the first of Michelangelo's freestanding statues. In May of 1496, Michelangelo made his first visit to Rome. It was here that he was introduced to Jacopo Galli, a Roman banker, who commissioned 2 sculptures from Michelangelo, one of which still exists today. It is of Bacchus, the Roman god of wine. Behind him is another mythological figure, a goat-legged satyr, who playfully nibbles at Bacchus's grapes. Bacchus, it seems, is too drunk from the wine to take notice. Michelangelo was next commissioned by a French cardinal to sculpt a Pietà in marble. Pietà is the Italian word for pity or mercy, but in the world of art, it refers to the Virgin Mary mourning over the dead body of Christ. His previous patron, Jacopo Galli, guaranteed that Michelangelo would complete the sculpture within a year and that it would be, in his words, the most beautiful work in marble that Rome can boast of, and that no master of our time will be able to do better. When one gazes at the Pietà and its solemn beauty, one realizes that Galli was quite right in his assumption. Rumor has it that when the finished piece was finally put on display in St. Peter's, no one could believe that a 24-year-old artist could have created such an impressive piece of work. Michelangelo was so angered by this that in the middle of the night, he snuck into St. Peter's and chiseled his name into the Virgin Mary's sash. This rumor could be true, as it was the only piece that Michelangelo ever signed his name to. Michelangelo returned to Florence in the spring of 1501 upon hearing that the Florence Cathedral Works Department was considering him for a major commission. A large block of marble, almost 20 feet tall, had been kept in the workyard of the cathedral for years. 40 years earlier, another sculptor had attempted to sculpt a mighty figure from the stone, but soon abandoned the project. Now it was Michelangelo's turn. He had always believed that every piece of marble he worked on already contained his finished subjects. He was merely chipping away at the stone to unleash the hidden form within. From this giant piece of marble, he saw as his subject the biblical hero David, the young boy who defeated the mighty Philistine Goliath, armed only with a sling and his faith in God. Michelangelo worked on David for 2.5 years. When it was finally completed, it was padded and roped and moved by rollers until it reached its final destination, in front of the palace of the Signora. It would eventually be placed inside for its own protection. In September of 1504, David was shown to an adoring public for the very first time. From then on, Michelangelo was considered the greatest sculptor in all of Italy. Upon completion of David, Michelangelo was commissioned by the Florentine Republic to paint a fresco on the left wall of the Grand Council's Hall in the Palace of the Signora. On the opposite wall, the famed artist Leonardo da Vinci was commissioned to paint a fresco of his own. They each chose heroic battles as their subjects. Da Vinci, 23 years older than Michelangelo, would paint the Battle of Anghiari. Michelangelo would paint the Battle of Cassina. Although both artists completed full-scale drawings of their subjects, neither of the projects were ever completed. Only reproductions of these paintings exist today. While still in Florence, Michelangelo also completed 3 tondos, which are circular works either carved or painted. These are the Pitti Tondo, which shows the Madonna and Child, the Tanti Tondo, which shows the Madonna and Child with St. John, and the Doni Tondo, which depicts the Holy Family, Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus. Michelangelo was also commissioned to produce the Madonna of Bruges, as well as this unfinished sculpture of St. Matthew. Before completion of this statue, Michelangelo was called away to Rome by request of Pope Julius II. Julius II was known as the warrior pope, as he would often lead the papal armies into battle clad in steel armor. Pope Julius was on a crusade to restore the papacy and Rome back to its former glory. He would become Michelangelo's greatest patron, but he would also torment the artist by his constant demands. When Michelangelo arrived in Rome in 1505, he was commissioned to build a tomb for the Pope, which would be constructed under the dome of St. Peter's Cathedral. 40 statues were to surround the tomb, but this was not to be. The Pope had ordered the cathedral, which was in disrepair, to be rebuilt, and construction of the tomb was suspended. Michelangelo became furious with the Pope and fled to Florence. Michelangelo and the Pope would eventually settle their differences, and he returned to Rome in 1508. With construction of the tomb still on hold, Michelangelo was commissioned to complete an even larger task, the painting of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Michelangelo insisted that he was a sculptor and not a painter, but the Pope refused to listen to him. He would be required to paint the 12 apostles on the ceiling. Michelangelo finally gave in to the will of the Pope, and work commenced on May 10, 1508. But Michelangelo had a grander idea for the ceiling that covered 5,800 square feet. He would depict grandiose scenes from the book of Genesis, as well as the ancestors of Christ and other prophets and sibyls. A scaffold was built 50 feet above the floor of the chapel. Assistants were brought in from Florence, but eventually Michelangelo dismissed them and completed the ceiling himself. He spent over 4 years crouched beneath the ceiling with the paint constantly dripping on his face and clothes. Pope Julius II would berate the artist almost daily to finish the project. When asked when he would complete the ceiling, Michelangelo would always reply, "When I can." The Pope became so angry one day that he struck Michelangelo with his cane. On October 31st, 1512, the completed ceiling was finally revealed. Michelangelo had created a masterpiece of eternal beauty. He was now not only considered the greatest sculptor of his time, but the greatest painter as well. Of the many images on the ceiling, there consists of 9 main scenes: God separating light from darkness, the creation of the heavenly bodies, the separation of the waters, the creation of Adam, the creation of Eve, the fall and expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, the sacrifice of Noah, the flood, and the drunkenness of Noah. With some 300 figures depicted, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel is a monumental achievement of the Renaissance, the likes of which we will never see again. Four months after the completion of the ceiling, Pope Julius II died at the age of 70. With the Pope's death, Michelangelo was once again commissioned to complete his tomb, but now on a more modest scale. The location was moved from St. Peter's to the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome. Michelangelo worked on the tomb on and off for 40 years. The central figure of the tomb was that of Moses. His right hand rests on top of the 2 tablets containing the 10 Commandments. The Old Testament describes Moses as having rays of light emanating from his brow, but in the Latin translation of the Bible, the word for light was mistakenly translated as horns, and so this impressive sculpture shows Moses with 2 horns on top of his head. According to legend, Michelangelo was so transfixed by his own creation that he banged his hammer on its knee and commanded it to speak. Between 1513 and 1516, Michelangelo also produced these slave statues for the tomb: the dying slave and the rebelling slave, although neither ended up on the finished tomb. They were substituted for statues of Rachel, also known as the contemplative life, and Leah, also known as the active life. The other sculptures of the tomb were completed by people other than Michelangelo. In later years, he would sculpt many other slave statues, but for the most part, they remained unfinished. Following the death of Pope Julius II, Giovanni de' Medici was chosen to become Pope Leo X. Giovanni was the son of Lorenzo de' Medici and a childhood friend of Michelangelo. Leo X wanted Michelangelo to design a facade for the Medici Church of San Lorenzo in Florence. This, however, was never completed, and the only achievement of any substance from this period is this magnificent sculpture of the risen Christ. With the facade of San Lorenzo abandoned, Pope Leo X commissioned Michelangelo to design and build the Medici Chapel next to San Lorenzo and the Laurentian Library. Decades would pass before the library was completed by the architect Ammirati in 1560. The final result, however, is a wondrous sight to behold. In 1521, Pope Leo X died, and Giulio de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent's brother, became Pope Clement VII. He too was a childhood friend of Michelangelo's. These 2 popes had wanted the Medici Chapel to house tombs of their fathers, but the only monuments to the Medicis are of Leo X's younger brother Giuliano, Duke of Nemours, and his nephew Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino. The statue of Giuliano shows the Duke as being quite confident. Beneath him are statues representing day and night. The statue of Lorenzo, on the other hand, shows him to be in a more pensive mood. Beneath him are statues representing dawn and dusk. Both of the Medici statues look toward the sculpture of the Madonna and Child. They're flanked by 2 patron saints of the Medici family. Lorenzo the Magnificent and his brother are buried in the sarcophagus base beneath the statues. In 1527, the troops of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V sacked Rome and set its sights on Florence. Michelangelo was entrusted with supervising the fortification of the city. The siege of Florence lasted 10 months before Charles V could claim victory. Pope Clement VII formed an alliance with Charles V and ensured the return of Medici rule to Florence. Michelangelo, fearing for his life, went into hiding until the Pope issued an order to spare his life. Michelangelo left the city of Florence for Rome in 1534. Shortly afterwards, Pope Clement VII died and was succeeded by Pope Paul III. Pope Paul III was a great patron of the arts and commissioned Michelangelo to paint a representation of the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. He began this enormous task in 1536, 24 years after he had completed the miraculous ceiling in the very same chapel. Painting alone, it would take Michelangelo 5.5 years to finish. When it was finally revealed on October 31st, 1541, Pope Paul III fell to his knees in awe. At the center of the painting is a beardless Christ standing in judgment. The Virgin Mary is seated at his side. He's surrounded by saints and angels. From the lower left, the saved float up to him, while the damned descend to hell on the right. The composition is as inspiring as it is unnerving in its intensity. Michelangelo, not without a sense of humor, painted his face on the flayed skin of St. Bartholomew. As with most of Michelangelo's work, he presented his subjects in the nude. When an official from the Vatican objected to the nudity, Michelangelo responded by painting him in as Minos, the judge of souls, in the depths of hell. Some years later, however, one of Michelangelo's assistants was brought in by the church, which had grown more conservative, to paint in draperies over the nude subjects. This, however, does not take away from the enduring power of this masterpiece. After the completion of the Last Judgment, Pope Paul III commissioned Michelangelo to paint 2 more frescoes which would adorn the walls of the Pope's chapel in the Vatican. The first was that of the conversion of St. Paul. The painting depicts Saul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus being blinded by the light of Jesus. Saul would become an apostle of Christ and change his name to Paul. The second fresco was the crucifixion of St. Peter. It depicts St. Peter being crucified upside down as he felt himself unworthy to share the same fate as Jesus. This was to be the last painting that Michelangelo ever completed. In 1547, Michelangelo was appointed chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. His designs for the church would consume most of the rest of his life, so much, in fact, that he never saw his beloved city of Florence again. A giant wooden model of the dome that would crown the church was constructed and shown to the Pope for approval. This model can still be seen today in the Vatican museums. The actual dome of the church is considered Michelangelo's greatest achievement as an architect, even though he did not live to see the church's completion. Before his death, Michelangelo sculpted 3 more Pietas: the Palestrina, the Florence, and the Rondinini. It's said that the sculpture of Nicodemus in the Florence Pietà is actually that of Michelangelo himself. On February 18, 1564, Michelangelo died at the grand old age of 89. The following day, his body lay in state in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Rome, where thousands came to pay their respect to the divine Michelangelo. According to his wishes, his body was taken back to Florence, where he was finally buried in the Church of Santa Croce. A state funeral was held in the Medici Church in San Lorenzo, where the leading citizens and artists came to give their final respects to the last great master of the High Renaissance. Michelangelo spent his entire life striving for perfection in his art. When we gaze at the beauty of the Pietà or the sheer might of the David, we're convinced he was able to attain it. The sculptor who did not want to paint produced 2 of the most glorious and powerful paintings the world has ever seen. Michelangelo's masterpieces from the era known as the Renaissance are a rich and enduring legacy of divine inspiration.